sugar actually as addictive as cocaine?
The rats actually preferred sugar if they had a choice. Brain systems that regulate reward in response to eating sugar or tasting sugar, behavior that are consistent with addiction, like withdrawal, cravings. It really just underscored how powerful of a reinforcer sugar can be. Maybe these like ultra processed foods are addictive.
When tobacco companies started to see the writing on the wall that their cigarettes were probably not going to be selling as well, they actually acquired many of these processed food companies with kind of the same playbook.
We're all at risk. Even though we may not all have the genetic propensity, we all have the environmental influence. But what's interesting about sugar is that it releases dopamine every time you use it. Food doesn't do that, only if it's a novel food. Sugar is addictive. Like, how do we manage that?
I love those two tips. Those are such powerful tips. If you just did those two things, you'd be so far. Hi, everyone. Really excited and honored to introduce you to a researcher who's doing what I believe to be some of the most important and impactful research of our time, and some of the research that people will tell you isn't valid, I'm sure. Like we'll discuss it all. There's a lot of controversy around what she's done, but she's a neuroscientist, a renowned research neuroscientist, author, and nutrition expert. We're going to talk about food addiction. We're going to talk about, is sugar actually as addictive as cocaine? And most importantly, where sugar's hiding and how we can, the steps we can take, the 7 steps we can take to kind of reduce the amount of sugar that we're consuming and improve our health in innumerable ways. So welcome, Dr. Nicole Avena. I'm really excited to have you here.
Oh, thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here. Can't wait to chat with you.
Yes. Now take me back. Ever since I learned this about you, you did your dissertation on cocaine versus sugar in rat models. You were at Princeton. You were leaving the bar sometimes to go check on the rats. Like, take us back to that time in your life. Like, did you have any idea how important this research was? What got you there? And just paint a picture for us.
Yeah. Oh gosh, it's funny when you put it that way. But yeah, so I started off as a grad student at Princeton. I was doing a PhD in neuroscience, and I was just hoping to see where it would take me. I really had kind of no vision of, what I was planning to study. I was just really interested in the brain and behavior. And my advisor and I started talking about what I was going to work on for my dissertation, which, as you know, is this like massive baby of a project that you do for 5 years. And I had been, kind of talking about how back in this point in time, and I'm dating myself, but this is going back to the year 2000, 2001. um, Back then people were, starting to talk about obesity rates going up, and, how this is like a public health concern. We need to start to think about it and talk about it, but nothing really to the extent like we talk about it today. But one of the things that I always found to be curious was, there's so many diet programs. There's like so many options for people to just like eat this and not that, right? It seems pretty straightforward, but people still really struggled and found it difficult to cut back on a lot of these ultra processed foods and the foods with a ton of sugar in them. And so my advisor Bart and I started talking about this idea of like, well, maybe like it's not the people that are not having willpower, right? Because that's what everybody would say back then. It's like, oh, they don't have the willpower to, just say no. But maybe it's something about the food. Maybe these like ultra processed foods are addictive, like drugs and alcohol could be addictive. And so at the time, it was a crazy idea because nobody was talking about obesity and addiction in the same sentence. The obesity researchers were like going to those conferences and talking to those guys, and like the addiction researchers were going to those conferences and talking to those guys. Nobody was talking to each other about this. So we were kind of mavericks in that capacity. And so we started doing studies, just basically asking the question, can sugar be addictive? And if I can like flash forward, basically the results are yes. We found like through study after study after study that yes, sugar can meet the criteria that the American Psychiatric Association has for being a substance that can be addictive.
Perfect. And we'll break down that criteria. But I do want you, because this is a famous study. I mean, this is a study I think so many people have heard about. And that is really rare for research. I mean, to penetrate the mainstream in, I think, the way that yours has. So will you break, what were you doing? What did you give the rats? What did you find exactly? I'd like you to share that.
Yeah, so we did so many studies looking at this. Really, again, started off looking in our laboratory rats, and that was in part because as neuroscientists, we were going to be, looking in the brain and trying to do all these assays that you can't really do in humans, but also because there weren't really any possibilities to do some of these things in humans because there was no control group, right? Everybody's had sugar. So we
Right?
really had no comparison group that we could use with human studies initially. So we started off with our rats, and basically we were giving our rats a sugar solution to drink. They also had food, they also had water, so they're never forced to drink it. And then we had different control groups. And basically, what we were looking at was, would the rats that are consuming the sugar, would they show changes in the brain that would be similar to what you'd see in our rats that were doing cocaine or using amphetamine or alcohol or other drugs of abuse? And so we were trying to really just understand if we could elicit the same behaviors and brain changes in rats when they're drinking sugar compared to what happens when rats are consuming drugs. And so we did a variety of different studies kind of looking at different questions around that. And I think the study that you're probably referring to is the one where, we were looking at whether or not the animals would show preference for sugar versus drugs. And, one would think, like, of course they're going to prefer drugs, right? Because that's much more reinforcing and powerful. But in reality, we found that no, the rats actually preferred sugar if they had a choice. And other researchers, you know, replicated that finding and looked at other types of drugs of abuse, basically to see the same thing. So it really just underscores how powerful of a reinforcer sugar can be. And I think it kind of goes back to, and we'll probably get into this at some point, the whole idea that, we're supposed to be addicted to sugar to some degree. It's something in nature, natural. And so we have this like biological propensity to really like it. And so the neural circuitry is in place for us to get really addicted to it.
Right. Okay, so tell me, yeah, we're gonna get into those mechanisms. If you had to guess, well, first, is there any human data today to suggest that sugar is addictive and as addictive as drugs?
Yeah, so the human data, there's been quite a bit. We've published some human studies as well, because right now we do what I would consider more translational research, right, where we're trying to basically translate, this basic science research in rats into humans to better understand how we can, serve the public and help public health. But yes, there have been many, many studies that have been looking at this in humans with respect to sugar preference, sugar, taste in terms of how much people like it. Also, the Yale food addiction scale is a scale that was developed that has been used pretty widely. It doesn't look specifically at sugar, it looks more at people's perceptions of food and relationships with food. But we've used that in some of our research. And yes, what we see on the human side of things is that there are overlaps between what we see in our rat studies and with the human studies. They dovetail nicely in the sense that we see changes in the brain systems that regulate reward in response to eating sugar or tasting sugar, changes in behavior that are consistent with what you would see with addiction, like withdrawal, cravings, and also really just this tolerance that can develop where people, much like with drugs and alcohol, where you know sometimes in the beginning of using something a little bit of it is satisfying, but then you develop a tolerance to it, and so a little bit isn't satisfying. You need more and more and more to feel that same pleasure that you used to get from just a little bit. And that's what we see happening with sugar, just like we see happening often with things like alcohol.
Yes. And we're a bit of a nerdy crew around here and we really like mechanisms. So don't be afraid to tell us what are those changes, neurotransmitters? Are there actual like structural changes? Like what is happening in the brain when you use a lot of sugar or even a little sugar? And is the amount, have you looked at the amount, the frequency?
Yeah, so yes, the frequency and the amount definitely plays a role. So we've looked at this and find that if we have control groups of our little rats that are just basically having sugar casually, like once in a while, or not binging on it, right? Just having it, but in moderation, as we would say in, our
Yeah.
terms, they don't show these changes in the brain that are associated with addiction. It's only the rats that are over consuming it or binging on it that seem to show these changes in the brain. And now you might say, okay, well, that's fine because, like, binge eating disorder is rare. Not all that many people are binging, but the reality is we're all actually binging on sugar. We just don't even know it. If you take a look at the amount of sugar that Americans eat. We're eating 16 to 17 teaspoons a day, and that's on average. And the amount that we're supposed to eat is like 6 to 9 teaspoons a day. So we're already like overeating it, even if we don't think we are. So that's really, something that I think is important to keep in mind. And then going back to your question about the mechanisms, yes. And so it's not only just the neurotransmitters, like we've looked at dopamine, we've looked at metabolites for dopamine, we've looked at opioids in the brain, and we see changes in the amount of those neurotransmitters being released in response to consuming sugar. We see that probably the biggest key finding when it comes to dopamine is that sugar can release dopamine like a drug would. And so, one of the hallmarks of drugs of abuse is that every time you use a drug, it releases dopamine in the limbic system, the nucleus accumbens, the reward system. And food doesn't do that. It only happens if you're hungry, like in a caloric deficit, or if it's a novel food. Those are the only times you really see a change in dopamine in response to eating a food. But what's interesting about sugar is that it releases dopamine every time you use it. And so it's
Mm.
like a drug in that capacity. So it's not just the release, it's also changes in the receptors, changes in the gene expression. It's really a very comprehensive change in the brain that happens as a result of consuming sugar. And it is something that is epigenetic too, because we've seen that, during pregnancy, when a lot of sugar is consumed, then the brain changes can actually be passed on to the offspring. So babies can be born with this proclivity to consume sugar just based off of what their mom was consuming in the womb.
Mm.
So,
And
yeah,
another thing, are there people who are more genetically susceptible to
there
these?
are.
Yeah.
Yes, and so there's quite a bit of literature looking at the dopamine DRD2 gene, which has been linked to addictive behaviors in general. And so people who have that genetic morphism often will be at higher risk for developing addiction to things like drugs and alcohol. And that's also been shown with sugar as well, and food and processed food in general as having a link there. So yes, there does seem to be a genetic piece of it, but I think it's important to keep in mind that we're all at risk, even though we may not all have the genetic propensity. We all have the environmental influence. And so even, we always talk about nature versus nurture. Like, yeah, nature gives us something, but we're all basically being nurtured in an environment that is promoting us to become addicted to sugar.
Right. And a few things you said there I want to highlight too. You say, we're having, 17 teaspoons, but I've read, and you can confirm this if you know, that a healthy level of blood sugar, when you measure it in its totality, is like 1 teaspoon, kind of, right? Like that's kind of what our body wants to maintain at any one time. And so, how dangerous is that we're doing 17 teaspoons every single day? And what amount of time does it take to really throw that out of balance? I know there's genetics involved in everything, but if you have you looked into that, and do you think that's accurate that about 1 teaspoon at a time is what we are supposedly supposed to have?
Yeah, I don't know off the top of my head what amount we would be putting on what we should supposed to have at any given time. I feel like the 1 teaspoon a day, yeah, or 1 teaspoon at a time, that probably
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense. Um, because what we see in nature is probably more aligned with that, right? So if you look at fruits, for example, yes, they contain sugar, but they contain it in smaller amounts, and they contain it packaged with fiber and other nutrients that are going to mitigate the effects that the sugar has on our blood system. So it's a lot of work for us to consume many of these processed foods that have 50% of our daily recommended amount of sugar. Like, when we have all this sugar floating around in our blood, if you're not like a marathon runner or like going out to like, hike the mountain, you're going to need that sugar to be put into other parts of your body. You're not going to utilize it as energy. So it has to get stored in our cells, and it typically gets stored as fat if you're not using it. And that takes a lot of processes in our body, a lot of metabolic work to happen. So it's taxing on our bodies to have to process all that sugar. So I
Yeah.
think that yes, cutting back on how much sugar we give ourselves at any given point in time is so important. And I think most people don't realize that. Of course, if you're an elite athlete or like running 10 miles or whatever, it's a different situation. But if you're just kind of like having lunch and then going to go sit at your desk and work for the rest of the day, yeah, all that sugar you're eating is going to get turned into fat and you're not going to burn it off.
Yes, and we're going to talk about the environment too, because you said something about novelty. And if you think about novelty releases dopamine, and think about the amount of processed foods that contain sugar that we have. We have variety for days. We could always eat a new highly processed food and again, like kind of negatively impact that reward system. But before we get into that and maybe how food manufacturers are creating these, or actually, maybe let's go there now. What do you think? What are the specific changes? How much money is being put into actually creating these foods? And what are the specific changes they're using besides sugar, if there are any, to potentially create addictive foods?
Yeah, so what you said about the novelty with the foods and the variety we have, I think that's important. And I think it's important to keep in mind around the holidays and, how we have a lot of companies have like caught on to this whole like seasonal release of certain flavors. Like for example, around, Thanksgiving, that's when you get the pumpkin spice, right? And you can't get it any other time of the year. So you
Hmm.
got to have it like right now because you won't get it again until next year. And the same with like around Christmas time, we have the mocha, whatever, whatever. So again, it's kind of like this whole like cyclical like release of these different types of foods and flavors. That's playing into the addiction. That's like part of it. And of course that's going to promote us to then like want it because you can't have it, right? So I think that that's important to keep in mind. And in terms of looking at these different food products that are being created, this is why we always see a new flavor, right? Like it's like, the new Doritos flavor is out or the new beverage flavor is out. Like they can't just stick to like one or two flavors because people need that constant variety, right? They want that. And that's going to promote the addiction. Yes, the sugar's a part of it. That's really, the vehicle in the brain that's driving the addiction, but there's also the psychological piece too that's very important, and people want that variety. They want to be kind of like, if you will, like in a like pinball machine in
Yeah.
many ways, like going back and forth to these different stimulants.
Yeah, and I love this Dr. Rob Wolf. Have you ever read his book? It's called Wired to Eat, and he talked about this food eating competition where this guy he was eating an ice cream sundae, and I think and he got almost ready to puke. And what did he do? Instead of stop, he asked for French fries, and he had to change the type of food he was eating. He was able to eat French fries for a little bit and then come back and then eat more of it, even though he wanted to. So it's that novelty, that constant environment that we're in that is prompting us and creating all of these too good to pass up items. And it's tripping us up. And they actually call some of those drinks, those holiday drinks, like diabetes in a cup. So really sad. I want to know too about the different types of sugars. We'll get into that. But have you gotten a lot of pushback? Have because I know like Yudkin versus Ansel Keys. I mean, a long time ago, there was a researcher, John Yudkin, who believed sugar was at the root of heart disease and all these illnesses. And
Mm-hmm.
in the 1960s, we kind of went with Ansel Keys's hypothesis that it was dietary fat. So
Fat.
I'm
Yeah.
wondering, have you been attacked, or what's it been like to have your research out there?
Yeah, I would say we've had a fair amount of pushback. So certainly in the beginning of my career, when we first started publishing and talking about our research findings at conferences, yes, definitely got a lot of tomatoes thrown at me in terms of just people saying like, "Oh, this is junk science." Like this is, we had a lot of food industry pushback initially that, typical like playbook, like, "Oh, this was done in rats, so it's meaningless research," and that kind of thing. Um, and just a lot of, I think, even in the beginning, from other scientists and from the medical community, just this sort of like scoffing, if you will. Like people just didn't really take this seriously. But it changed, and I think it's, like a testament to the fact that we kind of just stead our course and kept publishing papers and putting out the research, and it just ended up speaking for itself. And other researchers got interested in this and started replicating our findings and then publishing extensions of that, and then people started doing studies in humans, and it just kind of snowballed into like a body of literature now that, well, yeah, there's still some controversy around it. No one is debating the research. I think people believe that the research is real. I think now the pushback is, well, what are we supposed to do about it?
Right.
And I think that's where people are, struggling, because it is an important question. Yes, okay, if sugar is addictive, like how do we manage that? Like how do we Like, do we, regulate it? Do we put warning labels on foods? Do we still give it to our kids for Halloween? Like, how do we navigate that? And I think that's really where the controversy is lying right now.
And what do you think? Like, are you pro regulation? Do you like the soda taxes? You see a lawsuit now out of San Francisco against ultra processed food companies. Like, what are
Yeah,
your very educated thoughts on the matter?
I think there will be more lawsuits for sure. I think that's kind of the way in which the ball gets rolling in the United States with change. That's how we work. And that's what happened with tobacco, right? It wasn't
Yep.
until, the states started suing the tobacco companies that we started to kind of get this momentum that we had to do something about tobacco products. And, we knew that they were harmful. We knew that they were not safe, even though there were doctors and dentists that were saying of course they're good for you, they're nicotine's not addictive. So I think that's really the playbook I feel like we're going to see unfold again. But the sad part about that is it probably took a good 50 years to
Yeah.
go from the point where people started saying, wait, I think like cigarettes might actually not be good for us. Maybe we shouldn't smoke them, to the point where we started to really see, hardcore regulation warnings. And even in the US, where I know our tobacco consumption's going down, but I personally think we've just replaced it with food. So it's just, we've replaced like one evil with another. But even in the US with tobacco, we are not that great, in my opinion, of like the warning labels. If you go over to Europe, if you look for like a tobacco product in Europe, I mean, their warning label, the whole package is a warning label. Like there's actually no branding at all. The brand of the product is very, very small. The whole package is a giant warning label with like a fried out lung that's like, this will kill you. Like legit, like this, that, they're very upfront about it. So I'm for definitely for warning labels. I think we need to be careful about it though, because in Mexico, for example, with food, they are using warning labels, but then it gets confusing because the question is, okay, well, let's put it on all what we deem to be ultra processed foods. And so, there's products that are like kitchen staples, like stuff that you would use to prepare like traditional Mexican foods, that are being labeled as ultra processed foods. And so it takes away from like, the understanding of like, okay, well, how bad is this really for me if my great 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 grandmother was using this, to cook, something that we make in our family, versus like the chips and the sodas, which are actually the ultra processed food. So
Yeah.
there's a bit of a bit of a conundrum there with how do we kind of identify like which foods are we concerned about, which ones do we like want to target.
Yeah, I just think that's such an important point because my dissertation was actually on beef and how it changes based on the production system. And so, saturated fat, you go to Mexico, it's like contains sugar, contains saturated fat. And you know what I mean? I think some foods that contain saturated fat are far more dangerous than others. You got to take in dietary context. I mean, yeah, it is such a complicated matter, but I am encouraged to see people not attacking you in the same way and that there is a big conversation. And by the way, bringing up tobacco companies, when tobacco companies started to see the writing on the wall that their cigarettes were probably not going to be selling as well, they actually acquired many of these processed food companies
Yeah.
and they are creating, this addiction, I believe, with kind of the same playbook. And so I just think that's important. So we're going to get into your steps because I think they're so empowering. And I think you're right. We traded one thing for the other. The root of the issue is maybe like, what do we do instead? How do we handle, stress in life? And your program gets to that. But first, we didn't even talk about this. What are the consequences, right? Is drug addiction more dangerous than sugar addiction? What health consequences are we looking at? People have heard that there was one study several decades ago where sugar shut down the immune system for up to, a certain, I think it was the phagocytic index for 5 hours afterwards, whereas starch did not. From your perspective, from what you know, what are the deleterious consequences of the type of sugar consumption, say 17 teaspoons that we're having on average today?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple different ways that we need to consider this. So first there's the physical effects, right? So we know that too much added sugar in the diet can lead to a host of medical conditions, including, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, it can lead to obesity, it can lead to heart disease, it can lead to certain cancers. So there's all these medical conditions that we know can be promoted by consuming too much sugar. And then there's the sort of ways in which we're compromising our own health. Like you said, we're like impairing our immune system, right? We are in many ways impairing our cognitive functioning, because we all know that if you're on the sugar roller coaster, you're going to not be able to focus as well. You're going to be distracted. We see this happening a lot with kids who are eating these, high sugar breakfasts, and then they get to school and they're bouncing off the walls, and the teacher's not able to get them to pay attention, and then they're irritable and cranky, and then they have more sugar and it's just this whole like roller coaster. And then I think there's the mood piece, which we are starting to hear more and more about. A lot of psychiatrist friends of mine are getting more in tune to this idea that nutrition plays a significant role in psychiatry that's been ignored
Mm.
essentially the entire time that psychiatry has been in existence. If you have a low mood, if you're sad, you're blue, your diet can actually have an impact on that. Your diet can make it worse, your diet can make it better. And so many people now in the field of psychiatry are like asking people, like, if they are diagnosed with depression, okay, well, yeah, what are we doing to treat your depression? But we also need to look at your food, because we could be treating your depression, but you're making it worse by eating things that are just going to exacerbate it. So I think there's really multiple avenues in which too much added sugar can negatively impact our health. It's not just about diabetes and obesity anymore. It's about a lot more than that.
Yeah, and I don't know, you don't know my story probably, but that was why I got so into this research, is because my mental health improved so dramatically. And literally, when I have sugar, I feel sad the next day. And sometimes I still do, and I expect that I will. I know this. It's like a very specific thought pattern that I've identified when I eat too much sugar. And so can you take us to, I love that you mentioned that. Types of sugar. High fructose corn syrup. It's different than, is it different in your research? Kind of, can you, artificial sweeteners, agave. Does the amount of
Yeah.
fructose matter? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we could do like a whole podcast on every single one of those questions.
I know.
So okay, from the addiction standpoint, it doesn't matter. They're all affecting the brain in a way that's promoting addiction, right?
Mm.
So I think if your goal is to break away from being addicted to sugar, right? It doesn't matter which sugar you're addicted to, because it's the sweet taste that drives the addiction like response. And we've done those studies and shown that in our lab. Um, Now the question becomes, okay, well, what do we do about like these artificial sweeteners, or these non-nutritive sweeteners, or these low calorie sweeteners? I look at them as, for people who are really really struggling to cut back on their added sugar, or maybe they're just consuming so much added sugar that psychologically giving it up or cutting way back is just not going to work for them, then yeah, you could use those other sweeteners as a crutch. But I don't think that should be the end point. I really think the goal has to be to reduce our dependence on sweetness in our diet. So when I talk to people and they're talking about like, okay, well, I really want to cut back on sugar, we're starting with the beverages, and maybe they drink their coffee has like a ton of sugar in it. Okay, well, if you have to use one of these alternative sweeteners, but use less of it because they're already sweeter than sugar,
Right.
then fine to start. But you have to wean yourself off of the dependence on the sweetness. That is critical, because when we look at these sugars, again, from the addiction standpoint, they're all basically the same. But when we look at these different sweeteners from the physiological standpoint, there are differences. And so fructose does matter. Fructose is the component that is negatively impacting our liver, for example. And so
Mm.
when you consume too much fructose, and there's fructose in sucrose, and there's fructose in high fructose corn syrup, um, it's going to basically create a condition in which you're more susceptible to developing fatty liver disease. And so this is why we had to create a new name for fatty liver disease. It used to be that we never saw fatty liver disease in kids, because fatty liver disease was something you'd only see in like 50-year-old alcoholic men. And now we're seeing it in like 10-year-old boys and girls. And they're certainly not drinking alcohol. They're actually just drinking sugar. And so we had to create the term non-alcoholic fatty liver disease to be able to diagnose these people. So it's definitely bad for your liver, in terms of the fructose piece of it. And then, we can go on and on about these other sweeteners. But yeah, I'd say at the end of the day, my message would be, if you want to do the best thing you can for your health, it's to just reduce your dependence on the sweeteners. If you have to rely on some of these to get there, that's great, but you have to keep moving in the direction of reducing it as much as possible.
Awesome. And I know that certain formulations, like the amount of fructose and like high fructose corn syrup and some of these different, it changes. And I don't
Yeah.
think it always has to be labeled. So,
No.
yeah, again, yeah. And what about apple juice concentrate, fruit concentrates? Do you feel like these
All
are as
sugar.
metabolically and addictive? Do they have the same addictive potential and
Yeah,
metabolic
absolutely.
consequences?
Yeah. So that's why, the marketing is evil because a lot
Yeah.
of these companies will say, "Oh, well, it's sweetened with, apple juice concentrate." And, someone who doesn't know any better and not like we're all supposed to know this, not like this is taught in school, right? I mean, if you don't do a degree in nutrition or like do this for a living, you're not necessarily going to know this. It's not common knowledge. But people assume, "Oh, apple juice concentrate. Oh, so it's apples, so it's fruit, so it's good." And it turns out that apple juice concentrate is basically just apple juice that's boiled down to nothing but the sugar that's left. And then that's what they use to sweeten it. So you're not getting the fiber, you're not getting the other nutrients, but it's parading itself as being a healthy ingredient, which I think is something that should not be allowed or should be changed. And that's why, any of these sweeteners and there's over like 300 different ingredients that can be considered as added sugar. So it's not like you just have to know the like list of 5 things. No, it's literally like a list that grows and grows and grows almost every day of all these different ingredients that the food companies are allowed to include in their products, and they're considered sugars. And then on top of that, we have all of these other sweeteners that are being developed and that are also being introduced into the ingredients.
Yeah. And I want to get to your steps, but are there any like super egregious names for sugar that you just want to call out? You're like, here are a few that most people don't understand is just another name for sugar.
Yeah, I would say, the one that I think a lot of people are just not aware of are the concentrates, like
Yeah.
these fruit concentrates, because I think that we have certain terms in our lexicon that we just associate with being healthy. Now, I associate fruit with being healthy. Don't get me wrong. Fruit
Yeah.
is healthy when you have it in its native form, but when you concentrate it, like that's not healthy. Anything with concentrate is just like, a red flag to avoid. Um, and then I also think people are, not aware that anything that has an OSC at the end is usually a sugar.
Hmm.
And so you want to be mindful of those things and really just, I think that we need to kind of, and it's difficult. I'm not saying this is easy. Everybody's super busy. We just trust that, our food industry is going to produce foods that are healthy, but the reality is that they're not. That's not their job. Their job is just to make things that they're allowed to make and not get in trouble for in terms of the government.
Yeah.
They're not a health company, they're a food company. And so I think we need to keep those two things in mind. And that's where I think the people have to really take ownership of what they're eating and like look at the food. And if you don't know what some of those ingredients are, I mean, just assume that they could be things that are going to be bad for you, right? So
Yeah.
I think that that's something where we need to, as a society, kind of like do a little bit of a grassroots sort of intervention here and demand like more clarity and more transparency with these ingredients, because if people stop buying stuff because they don't understand what it is, then the food companies aren't going to be inclined to include it in the products.
I love that idea. And the last question before we get to the practical is just why do you think there's such a resistance? Because, and I'm not going to call out all dietitians because there's some great dietitians out there, but there is this everything in moderation, food's not
Yeah,
addictive. We need to eat, be able to eat a cupcake. Like, what do you think about that mindset?
I think that I agree with you. I think that and I have many dietitians that work for me.
Yeah.
But I think that they are trained in a way, much like doctors are, medical doctors are trained in this kind of antiquated mindset around how you should eat in a perfect world, which we don't live in.
Right.
And so I think that, many dietitians are trained under this guise of like, yeah, you should be able to eat everything in moderation. And, there's no such thing as a bad food. Well, I often turn that around on people when they say that to me, and I'll say, okay, well, what if I don't think it's actually a food?
I love that.
Right? Like if I don't believe that many of the cookies and the packaged goods that are out there, in my opinion, they're not a food. Like who decides what a food is, right? And that's where I think from a government standpoint, we need to kind of lock in a bit more because we've just let the like fox run the hen house with that in terms of like what a food can be, right? I mean,
Yep.
where do you draw the line between something that is a food and is something else? Like just because it's quote unquote like safe to eat because the ingredients are all grass, self-proclaimed grass, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
then
Mm-hmm.
how do we moderate that? I always will say, yeah, I think there's all foods are good in moderation, but they have to be a food.
Yeah.
And my list of foods is a lot smaller than what's out there in the grocery store.
I think that's such a beautiful example because I had a friend who ended up having an eating disorder. She was impatient. And like in order to graduate, she had to eat a cupcake and, not worry. And it's like, but these foods they're designed to addict you. So how is she the one that has a problem, right? This is there by design. This is the reward and the response they're designed to elicit. So thank you for that. That's awesome. So tell us, you have a 7-step program. I'd love to dig in, but I want you to tell us what are some symptoms that we might know are having a problem, having an addiction, that this is negatively impacting our life.
Yeah, so my book Sugarless goes through all the things that we've been talking about plus more, and talks about the 7 steps to really uncover hidden sugars, like where are they located. I think that's a key thing,
Yeah.
dealing with cravings and then how to conquer your addiction. But the question, it's so important that you just posed about, how do you know if you have a problem? And I think it's kind of like, other addictions, gray area addictions, like alcohol, I think would be a good example because, alcohol's legal, it's socially acceptable to consume it. There's like sort of criteria that you can meet where, yeah, you'll have a problem and maybe you need to get help and you're going to be easily diagnosed as having like alcohol use disorder. Maybe you get, in trouble with the law, or maybe, you have an accident while you're, drinking, and that's your sort of wake up call, right? So there's people in that category who then know they have a problem and need to get some help. And the same with, I think, overeating and with sugar addiction. Like if, maybe you have a health crisis now, maybe, your doctor says, you are extremely overweight and I'm concerned about your health, your blood pressure is high, you have cardiovascular disease, maybe you have these like comorbid medical conditions that are tied to your diet. So maybe that's your wake up call. But I think there's also people who kind of like with alcohol who are in this sort of gray area where they're like, I know I'm drinking too much, but nothing bad's happened yet, but it might, and I don't want it to. And I think that's what happens a lot of times with food, where, people know they're using food for the wrong reasons. They know they're using sugar to cope with stress. They know that, they're binging. They know that they're irritable and cranky if they, try to limit themselves, which is basically the withdrawal. But they haven't had this sort of like wake up call or like this aha health moment that like leads them to make a change. And so my perspective on it is, if you feel like you have a problem, you have a problem because that's a problem for you, right? You
Mm-hmm.
feel like you have a problem, so you have a problem. So I would say, anyone who's looking to improve their health, even if you don't have any problems with your medical health or psychological health or whatever, we all can benefit from cutting back on added sugar, because if you don't have a problem now, you might be building one and don't even realize it. So you might be having a problem later. And I often say this about children because a lot of parents will say, "Oh, well, my kid's lean and they do sports and let them have all the sugar that they want. They're just kids and blah, blah, blah." Yeah, okay, that's great, but they're now being set up for, a lifetime of health problems and these habits that are going to be really hard to break when they're in their 20s and 30s, and now suddenly, the health problems are manifesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say this book, in just like thinking about cutting back on sugar, is really important for everybody, but especially people who really, are starting to be concerned that, yeah, I'm eating too much of this stuff.
Yeah, and I, as a parent, I know my poor little boy. I mean, he's so embarrassed that we don't eat the same amount of sugar as everyone else, and it is everywhere. I mean, there's constantly a party. They have sugar at school, and the onslaught is real. And you talk in your book about using it as a reward too, and how dangerous that can be. So I highly recommend you pick that up because she recommends against it. A lot of very credible organizations do too, and she gives you steps for how to kind of unwind that. But also, I would really like you to take us through one of the most interesting parts of your book. How do we identify that we're having a withdrawal? Like, Because when we start, right, we start the process, and then in a few days we don't feel so well, and we think, oh well, this will make us feel better. So can take us through the hormonal responses, like what's happening when we get stressed, and why are we drawn to sugar? Take us through that whole thing and how we kind of unwind that cycle, and what we need to do to get out of it.
Yeah, so there's this biological propensity for us to think that sugar is safe. So we're born that way, and it's actually a good thing. Our ancestors who were, hunters and gatherers used to have to walk around the woods for like a couple days looking for a berry bush, and then they'd find one, and then they'd eat the berries, and they were sweet and delicious, and that was safe and good and nourishing. And same with babies when they're born, they have breast milk for the first time. That's the first thing that they eat, and it's sweet and it's nourishing and it's safe. And so we have this sort of biological imprinting to code sweet with safe. And the problem is that that's no longer the case, right? Now things that are sweet are most likely not safe. And
Mm.
so this is where, the problem comes in. And so from this sort of background of this biology that's driving us to think that things are sweet, what happens in our modern world? We get stressed out, we get overwhelmed, and so we want to temporarily feel better. And so what do? You self-soothe, you self-medicate with food. And so what's that going to do? That's going to increase your dopamine. It's going to make you feel good. It's going to be rewarding. And I think that right now, especially at this point in time, people are extremely stressed out over all of the different things that are going on, over just the access of information, like the input, like coming in from the internet all the time, like this constant bombardment, this overstimulation. That is a stressor, and that can increase cortisol, which is our stress hormone. And if cortisol levels stay elevated, guess what happens? Our body goes into survival mode and it stores fat. And so everything that we eat will be stored as fat because our body thinks, oh my gosh, there's some crisis happening. We got to store all the fat because I don't know what's going to happen. We might not get food at some point. We need to have fat so we can survive. And so, again, when we get into this vicious cycle of like self soothing because we're stressed out all the time, it increases our cortisol levels to be stressed out all the time. So we have some sugar to temporarily alleviate that. And then that sugar gets stored as fat. And that's where we've basically become as a society where, we in many cases are managing our lives with these foods that are causing us to become overweight.
Yeah. And you talk about in your book too how like when you eliminate it, days 2 to 5, we kind of have this like their bodies like screaming at us, kind of having this withdrawal. And we think,
Mm-hmm.
okay, we'll just have a little bit, but it kind of gets us back on that cycle. So we really got to just push through. So I want to talk about some of the foods you would lean on in that phase where we kind of just do push through. But first, I want you to tell me, like, where do you think the biggest needle movers for people are? If they eliminated three kinds of foods, types of foods, like is it sugary beverages? Like, what do you think are the most
Yeah.
important first steps?
Yeah. So, first steps for sure, and I say this to everybody, is start with your beverages
Yeah.
because the beverages are the often a big source of calories that people don't realize. And they're a different type of calorie because liquid calories go down a lot quicker than the solid ones. And anybody who's like a big smoothie fan, I challenge you to do this. Even if you're making a super healthy smoothie, which is great, take all of those ingredients and instead of chopping them up and putting them in your smoothie, eat them.
Yeah.
I mean, if you have to eat an apple, a banana, a handful of strawberries, oatmeal, peanut butter, like you would be fatigued just from chewing that stuff. But, if you were to throw it in a smoothie and drink it, then yeah, it goes down like nothing, right? So you can drink calories much more readily than you can eat them.
Yeah.
Which when it comes to smoothies, okay, maybe that's fine because, we're putting healthy stuff in there usually. But I will say when it comes to beverages like these coffee beverages that are more sugar than coffee, um, sodas, energy drinks, again, the calories in those go down very, very quickly and you never get full. Have you ever heard anyone saying like, "Oh, I'm full. I just had a soda." No,
No.
you don't get full from it. It's like the calories are like invisible in our bodies, but they certainly do get in there. So I would say start your beverages. And, I titled the book Sugar Less because I'm not an advocate for this total abstinence approach. I know there are some people who are, and it's great and it works for them, but I think by and large, most people are like abstinence failures, meaning that they've tried to abstain and it's not working. So now they're like, what am I going to do? And so that's where I'm, positioning that you can just do more if you do less, meaning like have a little less sugar. So if you're a coffee drinker and you usually throw a couple sugars in there or have the cream with the flavoring and the syrup or whatever it might be, I'm not saying don't have it. I'm just saying have less of it. And
Mhm.
you have to just slowly wean yourself off of it. And you can do it that way and you won't even miss it. And when you can master that and then get yourself to the point where you're zero sugar beverages, or if you are going to have it, it's once in a while and you're not going to be like, oh my gosh, I need another one, or I'm compelled to have this all the time. And it can truly be a sweet treat, then that's great. Then you've achieved. And then from there, the second category of foods I would recommend is starting with breakfast, because
Mm.
American breakfast is like a dessert that's been just like at 8 o'clock in the morning. Like it's not breakfast. It is so much a dessert that it should just be called dessert. Morning dessert is what we should call it. We should have morning dessert and evening dessert. Um, but yeah, starting there, really focusing on protein and healthy fat. I am a big fan of eggs. We have a farm and chickens, so I guess I'm like by default I have to like eggs because we got them for free. Um, but so hard boiled eggs and a half of an avocado. I mean, that's a great breakfast with a little salad or something like that. And again, it's about like reframing your mindset around it. Like, yes, it doesn't like at first come across as delicious as a bowl of sugary cereal might be to someone who's used to eating that, but you feel so much better when you eat a diet that doesn't have a bowl of sugar in the morning involved with it, and you're going to feel satiated, you're going to feel satisfied, and you're not going to have the cravings for more food in like an hour, which is typically what happens to people who have these high sugar high carb breakfasts.
I love those two tips. Those are such powerful tips. If you just did those two things, you'd be so far. And you talk in your book too about like spirulina, like a gram of spirulina. That actually has been shown to reduce appetite and cravings. And again, something like protein in the morning would do the same thing. So, are there other foods if people are like, oh my gosh, I'm having this crazy craving for sugar? Like, what are some of the foods that you lean on in that time?
Yeah, so there's a couple different like strategies that you can take. Sometimes it's really just about, okay, I have a craving for the thing I always used to crave, right? Which is sugar. So sometimes you can kind of pull this trick where you maybe have like a handful of nuts or something that's like really salty, which is
Hmm.
kind of like the opposite. And so kind of like we were talking about a bit ago, how you have that variety, and so you're like sort of changing your like palate's mindset into like, oh no, no, I'm eating something salty, and you can forget about the sweet thing, right? So
Hmm.
that's one strategy that I often recommend. And the other thing is, look, if there's nothing wrong with craving sweets, if you want something sweet, then that's great. But you have to just pick something that's healthy. So if you are craving something that's sweet, then, having a couple slices of apples, like maybe that'll satisfy it.
Yeah.
And I think that the biggest thing for people who are struggling with managing cravings is figuring out a plan of like, okay, if I have a craving, what am I going to do? Because when you don't have the plan, that's when you end up, diving into the bag of chips or the, bag of cookies. Figuring out a plan, making sure you have something healthy to eat in case you have this craving that comes on. And then also knowing that you can wait it out, right? And asking
Mhm.
yourself, is this truly a craving where I'm hungry? Or is this a hedonic craving where I just want to feel good? And I think a lot of people, when they step back and they're like, wow, I actually am not hungry. I'm just like stressing myself out about whatever. And I thought about cookies, and that suddenly seemed like a good idea. And that would have made me feel better. But now I realize, like, no, I'm just stressing about whatever. So I got to cope with that. That's important because I think that helps people to dissociate between actual cravings for foods that they really want versus actual cravings for just pleasure and for feeling good, which are very different things.
I love it. And a lot of times when I work with people, I have people do a pleasure inventory and you just name the top 10 non-food sources of pleasure, right?
Yeah.
Like a conversation with a friend. Can I take my dog for a walk? And on that palate shifting, I've noticed fermented foods for me, if I have them every day, for some reason, it seems to really keep my cravings in check too. And I know we're getting time to the close to the time where you've got to leave us. I want to ask you, gosh, one more question, and that is maybe, do you think there are any supplements you would recommend before I let you tell us what we've missed and where the research should go next? Are
Mhm.
there actual supplements? Like I know L-glutamine for some people is helpful. Have you looked into that? Are there things people can take that are more natural that could also assist with cravings?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of supplements that are out there. And I think that, I personally am of the mindset of supplements can be great for people who want to kind of like the sort of these alternative sweeteners, right? Like if you need a supplement to help you kind of bridge yourself to get to the next step, that's great. But I also think too, a lot of it is psychological when it comes to cravings. And so,
Mm.
kind of getting at the root cause of what's leading to the craving, I think is really important. And so I think that supplements have a place, but I also think that, we can't just rely on the supplement and not address the bigger issue, which is often, stress, figuring out, how to navigate in our food environment, which is really just so important to teach our kids, right? And to understand like that we're being marketed to, that we're, part of this, machine of just money that, we're basically being the victims of in the sense that, you know, we're paying for all this food and then we're also paying for it with our health too, because we're the ones that are getting sick from it. So I think helping people to understand that is so important and really just, getting to that root problem of what's causing the cravings and causing the binging and causing people to overeat or turn to these foods is important too.
Absolutely. And our son knows that when we go to the store, if sugar's in the first three ingredients, don't even ask. I mean, we have a Fun Food Friday and we do let him eat sugar, like,
Yeah.
but we don't bring that kind of stuff into the house. So this has been amazing, Dr. Vina. And like you said, we didn't even scratch the surface. There's so many strategies and additional types of information and mechanisms in your book. But as we close, I wonder, what do you think is next for the research? What do we need to be looking at? Is there anything we need to be looking at next? And do you have any famous last words or things that you think we miss in this conversation?
Yeah. Oh gosh, there's always something to be looking at, right? So
Of
it's
course.
never over. The
Yeah.
research is never done. That's why, we have to keep the science door always open because it's always an evolving story. Um, and so yes, I definitely see more going on in the research space. I'm personally more interested in understanding, the genesis of sugar addiction and how, you know, exposure to these foods. And keep this in mind, like, our kids are growing up basically like born into an addicted culture, and it's not even
Mhm.
food only, it's internet, it's gaming, it's all of it, right? And so we have this like addicted generation, like, it's to me
Mhm.
important for us to keep understanding like how is this going to impact them and when they become adults, and how does this look like 10 years from now, so we can hopefully get ahead of it and, help to mitigate some of the damage that is likely going to come out of it. But yeah, so I think that the research should continue and will continue. And, I really hope that, more and more people just kind of pause and just take a breather and sit back and really think about like, what do they want to eat? What kinds of foods do they want to be putting in their body? What do they want to be feeding their family? And if that comes at a cost of having to, really make some changes, change your schedule so that you can find the time to prepare the food and cook the food at home, it can be done. People do it all the time. We did it for generations prior to processed food, but we have to just, as a society, like step back and say, okay, what do we want? And I think everybody wants to be healthy. We all want to live long, healthy lives. So I think we need to make that a priority.
Yeah. And so now tell us, last thing, where can people connect with you and get your book? And then also, what do you eat in a day? Are you eating sugar? If you are, how often are you eating sugar?
Yeah. So, okay, to find more out about what we're doing in my lab and just about me in general, definitely check out my website, drnicoleavena.com. And I'm also on social media at Dr. Nicole Avena. Um, And you can get my book there on my website, and also all my books are available on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, like all the usual places. So definitely check that out if you're interested in learning more. And yeah, I eat sugar, but I'm like, I don't know. I grew up in the 80s. Like my parents didn't know any better, so we always had soda in the house, and it was just like I was like, Fruity Pebbles for breakfast, like kind of situation. And I don't know. I think I just, that's not what got me into this. I just serendipitously kind of came into studying sugar addiction. But, I think having seen that diet growing up, and then when I got older and on my own, and I started to see how, like, oh, I actually feel different if I don't eat those things. And, I have like access to these other types of foods. Let me try this stuff in college. I just felt like it made me feel better to not eat sugar. So I don't have a sweet tooth. Like, my
Mm.
family's a normal family. Like the kids, like, yeah, in the summertime we go out for ice cream. Like we do all those things, but I just don't like it. I mean, I don't really, have a preference for sugar. Now, if you took me to an Italian restaurant, I would definitely be ordering like a cheese and bread plate. Like I like those types of things better, I think more so than sugar. That's kind of my vice. But I'll very rarely have actual sugar. If I do, it's like chocolates. That's got to be really really good chocolate. Um, but yeah, I think that for me, I'm more of like a savory, salty type of girl.
Okay, so you're that mom who's they're getting ice cream, you're not getting an ice cream usually. I'm kind of that mom too. I usually take bites. And I just, yeah, I don't often eat sugar, even if my
Yeah.
son's eating sugar. And I think that's okay to do.
Totally. It's
Yeah.
totally okay. And I just think too, and I think it's good to be as a role model. Like I'm not doing it for that purpose, but like I've seen, my kids at certain times where they're like, oh, yeah, I don't want sugar. It's okay. I don't want any ice cream. Like I'm not getting any. I just don't feel like having it. And it's like, yeah, you don't have to, just because everyone's getting it doesn't mean you have to. Like you could say no, but still go out and get ice cream, but just not have any ice cream. It's like totally possible.
I love it. Well, thank you,
Yeah,
Dr. Avena. This has been amazing, and we are so grateful for your work. And you'll have to come back if you keep doing more experiments that we'll need to learn about.
absolutely. Thank you.